Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this session on behalf of a number of co-conveners that pooled their resources and put this session together. I'm happy to welcome you to this interesting, I hope, session on Earth observation and transboundary water management, where we're trying to bring together these often separate discussions of very techie people talking about all the things that are possible, and the more basin management, legal, basin organization people seeing that these developments happen, but still trying to at least sometimes figure out how this can be useful, how it can really benefit basin management, but also how it potentially affects the dynamics between countries in transboundary basins, especially also in relation to questions of trust, data that suddenly becomes available, that has been considered a national secret over time. So we're really trying to bring together these different communities and hopefully engage in an exciting discussion with all of you. My name is Susanne Schmeier. I work for IHE Delft and the Global Environment Facilities Scientific and Technical Advisory Panel. That's a mouthful. And I'll be your moderator today. What we'll do today is we'll start with 4 lightning talks where we hear 4 very different presentations on what exists in terms of Earth observation technology, what is potentially possible in the future, and also how that's being dealt with in basins by international organizations already. One of these presentations is online. I just want to check if Genna is online, if someone from the tech can just confirm. He's online? Yes, great. It's always a bit of a challenge having one speaker online. But then I'd say we just jump right into the lightning talks. They'll give you some ideas of what this topic is about. If you have any questions, note them down. If you're joining us online, put them in the chat, please. We have my colleague Zoe Rosenblum here helping with the online participants. And then when we move into the panel discussion, where we have a number of extra people joining us for the discussion, we'll then also start integrating the questions you might have in the room or from online. And for that, without any further ado, I'd like to hand over to our first speaker. Our first speaker is Liz Secocha from the World Resources Institute, also working for the Water, Peace and Security project, and being one of the masterminds behind a lot of the Earth observation data and the use of it for peace, water, security. Liz, please, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Susanna. Can you all hear me? Okay, fantastic. All right, great. So my name's Liz Secocha. I work on water security at the World Resources Institute and for the Water, Peace and Security Partnership. So at the World Resources Institute, we try to take academic learnings and technological innovations and turn them into data and tools that can be used on the ground. And at WPS, we use water as an entry point into peace. So I'm so excited to be here today to talk to you about what's been happening in Earth observation and how we can use that for transboundary water management and cooperation. Okay. So the first tool is Global Water Watch, and this is a global tool that provides time series of over 70,000 reservoirs worldwide. You can click on a reservoir, see the time series, and also view imagery for today or 2 different periods in time to see what you can see from space on what that reservoir looks like. And we're also working to include volume measurements for Global Water Watch. Okay, the next tool I want to share is GeoGlows, which is a streamflow model data set. Its forecast provides data in 3-hour intervals for the next 10 days and has applications in food security, climate change, and disaster risk reduction. So in addition to these 2 global tools, and there's so many more, but I have very little time to talk about them today, there's also local tools like this Mekong Reservoir Assessment Tool. And this is just for a specific basin that shows information on storage levels and reservoirs in this basin. So this is not a complete list, but hopefully this list here gives you an idea of what you can do with Earth observation data. You can monitor crop health and know what you need to do about irrigation using evapotranspiration data. You can predict future stream flows using snow depth information. And there's cool advances in water quality monitoring from space, which is kind of a really hard thing to crack right now, and we're hoping to do that more. So there's so many things you can do. There's things that you can't do too, and we'll talk a bit about that. But how is this data used in practice? So first, Earth observation data can establish a common truth on water resources. It can serve as an authoritative data source, avoiding disagreements about preferred data or methods between two negotiating countries. And with this information too, you're really omniscient to what's happening in water resources. So, a country downstream might not realize that the country upstream is also struggling with similar water challenges. But with this data, it really builds trust and good faith knowing that there's challenges, up and downstream in the same basin. Okay. And then next, countries can be alerted instantly when there are water challenges upstream in their basin. Instead of waiting for an upstream country to tell them about different water challenges coming downstream, pollutants flowing, or flood stages, they can respond faster, and this can have really important implications to safeguard their populations, their agricultural, energy, and water supplies as well. And by having this more, planning and stability, this can also build peace and better human security in a basin that alleviates more like spillover effects of conflicts that can spread across the basin as well. Okay, next, countries can more consistently and frequently monitor their water resources. So we tested Global Water Watch with the Ministry of Water in Zambia, and they've told us that Global Water Watch can help them more efficiently ensure compliance on water permits. It can help monitor climate change impacts on water resources. They use it to communicate with clients on reservoir storage, and it can help resolve water-related conflicts in the basin because it's a different data source. It's something completely separate from what they would normally use and not bias. Next, in the Murray-Darling Basin of Australia, researchers have seen that remote sensing can improve transparency and accountability in water sharing plans, especially at ensuring volume storage compliance. And then finally, this is a really interesting story I heard from the USGS, where they equipped Iraqi water managers with training and remotely sensed data, and then they were able to bring their own information on the basin water resources to the negotiation table with Turkey, and they all had a common truth of what the water resources were like in that basin at the time. So when countries come to the negotiating table with Earth observation data, they can share this common truth as well. So there are so many things that we can do with Earth observation data, but there's also things that we can't do, right? So a couple challenges that we're having is that case studies are really sensitive and people don't want to share them. So it's hard to learn from these case studies, and we're hoping to work on that with water, peace, and security. In addition, Earth observation data supports local data, but it absolutely does not replace it. So we need local data to calibrate Earth observation. And in addition, by sharing data between basins, it can build connections that wouldn't normally happen, and we don't want to lose that too. Earth observation data can have a high barrier to entry. These data sets can be enormous and require thousands of dollars of cloud computing credits. But what we're trying to do with Global Water Watch and some of the other tools is distill all of that information into a single statistic that makes it really easy to use. Sometimes when deciding to use Earth observation data, local water managers aren't really consulted. And the people that are doing the analysis, the monitoring on the ground, need to be the first people who are, taking this data up and trusting it and using it and advocating for it. And one of the problems and the challenges with that is ensuring trust, quality, and credibility for Earth observation data. And we hope that we're working on that by saying what it can do and what it absolutely can't do. And then finally, there's so many cool tools that use Earth observation data, but they're often pilots and don't always have sustainable funding. So we're hoping to work on this by really partnering with user groups and showing how this can be used and how this can improve transboundary management. So lastly, how we're working on this with water, peace, and security. So we're really hoping to build this knowledge case and as showing a case study in the Volta Basin in East Africa. We're working with the Wetlands International Sahel office to interview different stakeholders on the ground and understand the strengths and weaknesses of Earth observation data in this basin. So to conclude, Earth observation data won't fill every need, but it certainly can support better water management in transboundary basins. And what we can't do today with Earth observation data, we might be able to do a lot more of tomorrow because there's so many researchers working on this right now. But this takes partnerships and frank discussions with water managers telling us if they trust it, what needs to improve. So I welcome you to have that discussion with us after this, and please reach out. So thank you so much, Susanna. Over to you. Oh, sorry, here we go.
Thanks a lot, Liz. One of the things I love about Liz's work is the enthusiasm that she brings to this topic. And I think this is really fascinating. And I think that's also really at the core of today's session. There's so much out there that a lot of people with a lot of knowledge and a lot of enthusiasm have developed. But if all of you are honest, how much do you know? How many of the tools that she mentioned did you know? How many of the parameters that can be measured, that can be worked with, are you aware of? Did you know that's available? If you work on the topic, a lot, I assume. However, if you don't, probably not a lot. And I think this is exactly the gap that we want to bridge in today's session, or at least start bridging, and then you can keep the discussion going. Because as Liz was saying, there is a lot out there already. But there's even more that's being developing right now that will be developed in the future. And we'll get some insights on that from our next speaker, who's joining us online. Gennady Donchits from Google is also one of the masterminds behind a lot of the Earth observation work that has been done for water, but also for other topics. So I hope, Genna, you are able to join now. I have a very simple question to tech. How can Genna advance his slides? You do that. Okay, that's great.
Okay, so
Genna, go ahead.
I hope my audio is working. So hi everyone, so I will be just saying next when it's necessary. Okay, I see my slides. Perfect. So let's get started. So I'm Gennady Donchits, and thanks for inviting me to this to give the talk here. So unfortunately, I could not attend in person the meeting, but I prepared slides to talk about the question focusing on what's feasible in the future with regards to Earth observation technology and data. And so I work for Google in Netherlands, in Amsterdam office. My role is cloud geographer. So I'm helping organization to work with Earth observation data. For the last few years, it's mainly focusing on private public sector. So it's more leveraging Google technology like Google Earth Engine and many other tools. Next. So I was not involved for a few years also in research actively of water. And here you see very small text, so I don't think you will be able to read. But because I was not actively involved, I basically asked our AI speaking, it's this type of so natural language processing tools. It basically aggregates all vault information and gives some kind of hypothesis. So if the slide will be shared after the talk, then it's feel free to read details what it answered. But I used it basically as an outline for this talk, this topics defined there. So next. And so if you look at what's happening from technology,
hear us, Gunnar?
satellite mission being sent in space. One of them prominent to mention here is SWOT. It's basically the mission which was from the beginning focusing on hydrology and let's say high resolution measurements of elevation data. So you see this on the left here, and it's basically satellites which can measure elevation of water surface, and it's used for coasts or for oceans, but as well as for inland water, up to 100-meter wide, let's say, the water bodies. And this is quite important parameter because we could monitor, and we were able to monitor for many years how surface water extent is changing. So because from top you just make photos and you see how wide your rivers or reservoirs are. And Lise mentioned this in Global Water Watch is one of the tools that was developed. But there are many research and tools have been developed over the last years. But measuring elevation is quite another challenge, and you need that, of course, to estimate volume and to see how much water you have available and how its dynamics is changing. Next. And there are also some missions which already existed for some years, but they actually were not utilized yet to the extent I think that that is possible. So one of them is ISAT-2 mission, which basically it's a laser on top of satellite, and it measures. There is actually 6 lasers measuring also the elevation and basically the response from Earth. And once it reaches from 600 kilometers in space, it shoots signal laser down, goes back, and the footprint on land is about like 15 meters, and it's like in less than meter you get this. Uses to surface. And next. And so last but not least, there are, of course, many more missions coming and many satellites available out there. So combining all this data from these missions and really extracting proper signals, that's really will be also one of the challenges in the future. Really making sure that this would be brought to the decision makers and not available just for researchers. And that's I think, one of the important challenge. Next. So the second question was, or the second answer, what this ML or AI suggested, that there will be more enhanced forecasting and prediction. And while we can capture with the satellite missions or in situ data, local ground data, also the events like floods or droughts, the making prediction accurately, especially for hydrological, for rivers, this was always like very fragmented technology. So doing this globally or also increasing accuracy, this would be, of course, one of the topics. And here I showed, like on the right, it's some of the tools or analysis I was still doing when I was working for Deltares. So analyzing floods basically day after it happened. And on the left, you see one of the Google tools. It's we have a research team working on hydrological forecasting, which basically on any place on Earth, currently it's limited to only some areas, can predict, let's say, how the water level would be looking like in these rivers. Next. And then the next topic is making use of AI technology and machine learning. And you saw beginning of this presentation, so I already made use of it to just predict text. So of course we have now ML algorithms, AIs that can process audio, can text and video and combined, but making use of development of like foundational models. So what you see, Google is developing applied for Earth observation data, where the basic idea is that you train ML or AI on huge amount of data and anything available that you can measure, and then you try to use this to really learn patterns in your land use data. And this is something what we will be seeing also coming here to distinguish different land use types, classify, also detect changes, and so on. Next. And so I have just 1 minute left. So next topic was to mention here is more advanced data sharing and data accessibility and sharing. And that's where technology, of course, plays crucial role. So moving this process and harmonization of data into cloud, that will be crucial, but not only Earth observation, also in situ local data. So technologies like Google Earth Engine, you probably heard as a platform where we collect a lot of imagery data from also weather data. So it's not just satellite data, but any raster image data. But tools like BigQuery or Vertex AI and integration of all these tools and also running in cloud, this will be also the important trend. And also to combine local data as well as forecasts and as well as imagery data. Next. And this, of course, puts stretch on the technical capabilities that you would need to actually set up this system. So working together in partnership between different organizations is important. Here's an example of potentially how these different services, platforms could be layered to really create, let's say, solution. Next. And so here's the last slide is more showing like the example of applying this to water monitoring. This is something of one of my colleagues is doing. There is also paper reference you can find here. And I don't have time to really go into details, so I will close my talk with this slide. Yeah. Thank you so much for attention.
Thank you. I'm always impressed by what's possible now, what will be possible in the near future, but then also trying to think ahead, what will be in 5 years, what will be in 10 years, if we keep moving in that extreme speed, and what we will be able to do, but also who will be able to do that, and who will decide where we're headed in which direction, who will decide which Earth observation will be available for whom, what it will be used for, who will benefit from it and who maybe won't benefit from it. So I think these are questions that we also want to discuss today. So we're moving now, after these two more sort of tech-focused presentations, towards two other perspectives, where we'll hear from the World Bank and from the Nile Basin Initiative on their thoughts on it. We'll start with Christina Lipp from the World Bank. She works in the legal department, has worked on a lot of treaties with a lot of basin organizations, and will share some of her thoughts on how what we just heard about might link to questions of data sharing, data access, and so on. Christina, please.
Thank you, everyone, for coming, and thank you for the invitation and organization together. You'll hear more my personal perspective as an international water lawyer on what Earth observation means for international water law, and then the application in transboundary basins, and why international water law. One of the most challenging aspects in transboundary water management is the data sharing agreement on data sharing between riparian countries. And therefore, it's important to look at what Earth observation data does to transboundary water management. How does it interact with international water law? And I'm going to use the UN Watercourses Convention as a base text, mostly because it was based on 20 years of research of global state practice and was then negotiated and adopted at the global level. It's not the global convention with the biggest membership. That's the 1992 Water Convention, but which is also based on the research that went into the UN Watercourses Convention. And the UN Watercourses Convention is a good base text which has a well-structured way in outlining sort of general principles of water law and obligations. The International Law Commission that worked on the convention very much sort of recognized the importance of regular data exchange and information sharing for transboundary water management, and codified it as a general principle into the convention. It's not a customary principle. It needs to be written into treaties as an obligation. But important to know here is that there are two elements to it. One is the sharing of readily available data, and the second is the due diligence obligation of countries to use and collect readily available data. And so Earth observation data now comes in as readily available data because thanks to the WMO, UNFCCC, and outer space legal frameworks, a lot of that information is publicly available now, made publicly available by space agencies. And there are a couple of water law obligations that are linked to data exchange, notification obligations, sharing information on planned measures, and then this due diligence to know, to have the knowledge to make sure to prevent significant harm. So knowing what's the weather forecast, how do I need to manage my hydropower cascade to avoid, for instance, dam failure, flood damage downstream, but also to implement equitable and reasonable utilization when a country plans a new use, being able to assess, is it equitable, reasonable with respect to the entire basin, knowing what the entire basin looks like. So what are the challenges of implementation of data exchange and information in transboundary basins? As I said, challenge of sharing data. And the reason for that is that a lot of water data is actually securitized. There are access restrictions. And also even the UN Watercourses Convention, which was drafted in the 90s, recognizes that countries have the right to withhold data if it is of national security concern. Second challenge, as I said, difficulty of reaching agreement on it. Of the treaties that only cover 60% of the basin area, only 50% actually have data exchange obligations built into them. And then the third challenge, water sector, we hear it in a lot of sessions here, water sector is notoriously underfunded. There is just in many places lack of data or even lack of money for maintenance of data systems once they have been installed. Come all the opportunities of Earth observation data that my previous two speakers already talked about. Lots of opportunities, lots of data is available. As I said, a lot of it is available for free from NASA, ESA, and it's at higher resolution, but even private sector nowadays provides data at relatively lower costs, given that there's so much advance in technology. So with this availability of data, the argument for withholding data becomes much harder to make. And also, as was pointed out in the first presentation, now countries, when they come to the table, they have sort of a common data set available based on which they can negotiate and continue sort of trust building between countries in negotiations. And then we have a third point. Even in the absence of treaties, there is better forecasting capacity for everyone. But also, as my speakers pointed out, Earth observation data is only complementary. So there is still this need for data exchange of ground data to validate models, to make it usable, to be able to do day-to-day operations in a basin. So the real opportunities of this additional data can only be achieved with treaties. And here it is important to build data exchange obligations into treaties and to make these obligations flexible so that the procedures of data exchange can keep up with technology change. So provisions like we have in some treaties from the 1960s where it's written into the treaty, the data needs to be shared, the daily flow data needs to be shared once it's tabulated at the end of the month, and it needs to be shared at the latest 3 months after that calendar month. They are completely obsolete and shouldn't be in treaties. What we need is an obligation that says data sharing will be specified in procedures, and these procedures then can be adjusted. And that's, for instance, what the Mekong Commission does. That's what SAMCOM does in the Zambezi. And then I just referenced sort of the river basin organizations. Also very useful if treaties between countries establish river basin organizations or mechanisms, sort of joint mechanisms that have standing staff and where capacity can be pooled, staff capacity that can actually manipulate the data, build models, build forecasting models for the basin, planning models. So really sort of take advantage of the low cost, but also the cost sharing that can be done by pooling resources in river basin organizations. So very quickly I come to the conclusion, because I'm running out of time. What will happen with international water law? We'll see probably a change of and we are already seeing a change of the data exchange obligations. Due diligence obligations increase because now countries really have the due diligence to use that data, the space data that is for free available to them. in particular for the implementation of equitable and reasonable use. The challenges that remain in terms of complementarity and the need for technological capacity and technical capacity of staff to actually use the data that can then be filled by having treaties where countries pool resources, establish organizations with staff that have the knowledge to use the data, and also use models that are freely available in the market. So that's also very important, sort of really sort of making sure that we take advantage in when we work with river basin organizations of the data and models that are available free for cost, because we know also that river basin organizations don't have a lot of money. They're typically staffed for resources. And with this, I conclude. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Christina. I think that was a very interesting overview, moving from what's available also to what the challenges are, but also what the opportunities are, not only in terms of technology, but also in terms of advancing a legal regime that helps us govern the water resources that we share. We now want to take this and zoom into a specific basin, into the Nile Basin. And I'm happy that we have Michael Kizza with us today from the Nile Basin Initiative, who will share some of his experiences around this topic. Michael, please.
Good morning. Good morning. So I'll quickly share some experiences that we have in Nile Basin in terms of using Earth observation for the work that we do. The Nile Basin Initiative is an intergovernmental organization established by the 10 member states. I won't say them here, but you can Google. But for sure, NBI was established for countries to share the benefits that come from this shared resource. And sharing a resource, there are a number of things that you must do. One, you have to understand what you're sharing. If you don't know the size of the cake, how can you say everyone is going to get so much? So understanding the river, the pressures that it has, the evolution in terms of water availability becomes very crucial if you're to sit down and have this discussion. So within NBI, we use Earth observation a lot because in our basin, availability of in-situ data is always a challenge. We have a very big basin. The monitoring network peaked some decades back, and right now it is all downhill, and it seems globally there's nothing we can do about it. So Earth observation becomes a very, very important tool to be able to supplement the in-situ measurements. Within NBI, we use Earth observation for analytic work, for modeling, for building our knowledge base about the different aspects of the basin, but also derive policies. Any discussion around water, especially when you're bringing nations together, the first thing that you need is the evidence base of your discussion has to be quite thorough, and Earth observation bridges this gap. So the objective of having Earth observation at NBI is really to enhance the management and decision-making processes that we have. In the past, obviously, data and information exchange was always a problem among countries in a transboundary context. That situation hasn't changed. It's still, data is always considered a security issue, and for many other reasons, it may not be shared readily. Some of the studies we carried out in the past was that sometimes we fail to communicate to the countries. They have all this information, sometimes in old formats of storage. There's a lot of data loss, but they're keeping it and they don't want to exchange it because of some other reasons. So within NBI, some of the things that we want to do when we are carrying out our assessments is number one, improving water management. Monitoring has always been a very, very important aspect of the work that we do, and we keep supplementing the country's efforts with some additional monitoring stations for water, for hydrology, for water quality and others. But it's not enough, and Earth observation comes in very handily. Again, a number of barriers had to be overcome because, again, when countries come together to have a discussion about a certain use of water, they really want to have trust in the numbers that you may be coming with to them. And you have to have a process that builds that trust. Capacity building becomes a very, very important thing, because while experts are using some of these Earth observation tools, they're also building their trust in the outcomes of that analysis. Transboundary cooperation is very important, but more and more we are looking at issues of climate change, environmental change, land use change. So even these in-situ measurements that we may have, which are most times they are old, some of them, they may not be telling the current picture of what is happening. And ultimately, we build into supporting project development, which is a very major part of the work that we do. The next few slides look at some of the tools that we have. One of the main tools that we have as NBI is what we call the Nile Basin Decision Support System. Developed more than a decade back, it has been like the basis of all of our analytical framework and analysis of the work that we do. And the guys who developed it then were very forward-thinking, because it has some capacity to assimilate some Earth observation data in addition to the database that it already has, and carry out analysis. But we're also starting to discuss how to improve it to be more able to use some of these tools as we go into the future. We've carried out some climate change projections and developed a database from different tools that are available, and we use this for projecting hydrological scenarios in the basin and issuing bulletins to countries around this. We are currently developing a river flow forecasting system, which together with some other tools can also be used for flood forecasting. We've developed a Nile Basin climate proofing hub, because we realize that, of course, in the Nile Basin, we have a lot of hydrological infrastructure, and a lot of these were developed at a time when change was not really something that we took into account. And we realize that some of these analysis and some of like designing of spillways, some of the dams that we have spillways that no one is sure that they can be sufficient to handle the pressures put on them right now. We issue some bulletins and early warning systems to countries, especially during periods of flooding, and this is something that we do routinely together with the countries. We've installed a receiver of data and information at our headquarters, again to try and make all this information available. Now we are developing some customized products that then we can issue to countries based on their demand for specific use. Recently, we already said that Earth observation, and I think it was mentioned in the earlier presentation, Earth observation supplements in-situ measurements. So we don't forget about improving the in-situ network, but rather we bring the two together to be able to get the best outcome. And recently, supported by the German government and EU, we installed 43 hydrological stations that are automatically measuring and transferring data through satellite to the national centers. And these are becoming a very, very important tool, especially when it comes to early warning, because then you can get these alerts in real time, and the countries are better able to respond, for example, in flooding situations. This combination is really helping. I'm showing some graphs where we have data based on that in-situ network, and then using GeoGlows and GlowFast to be able to forecast, for example, hydropower output, to be able to advise countries on, or the operators on what is possible and what is not possible. So in a nutshell, within the Nile Basin, we have a sparse distribution of ground network, which does assessments, and enhancing this information is very important. And the technical capacity of Nile Basin professionals has been improved, and we are continually improving it to foster stronger collaboration among Nile Basin countries using Earth observation and common platforms for addressing shared water challenges and opportunities that cooperation brings. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Michael. You can actually stay with me because we're now moving after these 4 presentations into a panel discussion. So we'll have Michael stay with us, but I'm also going to invite a few other panelists who will join us and will be ready to discuss with you, but also answer your questions on how Earth observation can be helpful, what challenges it is facing, but also maybe which questions we need to answer as we move ahead with this super fast development of technology in order to make sure that basin organizations, countries, anyone working on this topic can actually keep up with the developments and ensure that all the questions around data, information, availability are being handled in a way that's not only efficient for water managers, but also equitable, fair, sustainable, and so on. So for that, in addition to Michael, who will join me on the panel, I would also invite our other panelists, Tomasz Rodic from the Center of Excellence for Space Science and Technology from Slovenia. I'll have Brian Ehler, I think sitting in the back there, from the Stimson Center. We have Nina Kickinger from the UN Office for Outer Space Affairs. We have Botta Sharipova from IHE Delft. We have Melissa McCracken from Tufts University. And I think I lost my notes, I have to admit, but I think we have everyone talking about technology. That's I think we need to squeeze a little bit around here. And I would actually like to start with you, Tomasz, having heard this and the knowledge that you have from the own work that you do in Slovenia, but also all around the world. Which types of monitoring, but also which types of analysis do you think will really bring change, will bring progress to these different water bodies? And maybe you can illustrate that with an example.
Yes. Thank you very much for this. From the first two presentations, in the lightning section, somebody can ask, what else do we want? But I can tell you, they want higher resolution, more frequent data, shared and better availability. And I can tell you that in our center, we have committed in a UN commitment to bring new revolutionized microsatellite technologies on board. And actually what we are doing is to combine microsatellites with river basin monitoring. And we participated in a kind of pioneering flight of the European Space Agency where more than 50 small satellites were launched at the same time, all with different tasks. This is our satellite, and I will show you a little bit what it does. This illustrates our thinking. It's a kind of agile satellite that can follow coastal areas, river basins. You can observe maritime traffic with it, monitoring also kind of natural resources extraction, and so on. And what the satellite is really specialized about is to monitor river basins from source to sea. And also in perpendicular way, in such a way that it connects. So for example, in the Sava River, a lot of data are available from Sentinels and Google, but we can fly over rivers and collect high resolution data, even higher than Sentinels, and also provide a kind of global picture, like this is one when we have high resolution and low resolution at the same time. And we can monitor, like in Vietnam, this like the whole river basin in one overflight. Now, this brings you, like, if I would tell you the satellite technologies are one part of it, and they can be used for multi-sectorial things. Forestry, agriculture, water management, maritime tourism, in just one picture. But we bring all this data, satellite data, into digital twin models, map them on the real configuration of ecosystem, and try then to do the interactions between soil, water, vegetation under different meteorological conditions. And this is really physical model that also influences the river flow. So this is actually what I would like to do. And what we do now, we can help local communities, right? Just like a local community around the bridge in Narrow, and put their local, very local situation in the context of a kind of macroscopic conditions as well. For example, that you have now a macro region around and how the rain actually penetrates the river and affects their bridge, also in the case of very global parameters. And this is actually what we want to do later on. I can show you some more examples, exactly how we connect. But this is like in last August, Slovenia was hit by the major disaster, 10 billion euros damages in one single disaster, and I can tell you later on how this is related to a different scales. Thank you.
Thank you. I think this is really interesting, and it's another example of what's possible. What I'm curious, and I'm moving over to you, Brian, having all this technology available, also looking at the work that you've done in the Mekong and elsewhere, how do you think these technologies, the information that is available to experts, but maybe also to non-expert people, how does that shape how we see shared water resources, how different users, their different interests perceive their water resources?
Thank you, Susanna. Thank you for inviting me to speak here. I'm going to talk a bit about our work with the Mekong Dam Monitor at the Stimson Center, where we use synthetic aperture radar satellites, microwave satellites, and optical imagery to monitor the 60 largest dams in the Mekong Basin. And I work in the very complex political space of the transboundary Mekong Basin. And our work is important, I think, because one, the basin has been experiencing a lot of variability in terms of the hydrological flow and changes to its features over the years. And there's been a lot of speculation as to why that's happening. Is some of this happening from dams? Is some of this happening from climate? And how do these interact together to understand, what's changing around various features of the basin, how it's impacting livelihoods? And also, it's important because China has the largest dams on the Mekong. And a lot of that speculation is into what China's dams impacts are. And before our work began, there was only speculation. And our work is enabling an environment to understand how much is coming from the large dams and how much is coming from climate and other impacts. And also, we're doing this because there has been a robust conversation amongst the downstream countries about data sharing. And we've kind of entered the fray as a way to catalyze a more robust conversation between the downstream and China to create enabling conditions for better data sharing and understanding about impacts. But before we talk about those impacts, we got a lot of slides to run through here. I want to show you again how our work is helping people in the basin see the...
I think that's still the other slide.
Okay, great.
There they are.
This is an example of how Earth observation technology is helping people in the basin see various features in a new way. Often we think of rivers as lines on a map, but our work is now monitoring the Mekong flood pulse in a way that helps people understand how the river is a shape and the river's features are a shape, and help us think about rivers in multiple dimensions with width and depth and change over time. So what we're looking at here is an example of a normal Mekong flood pulse. And you're seeing the Tonle Sap Lake expand 5 times over the course of a normal monsoon season in the Mekong Basin. And this drives the world's largest fish catch. It's responsible for creating the food security of the country of Cambodia, and also driving the agricultural productivity of Vietnam and Cambodia. And one thing, if you can see here, that the peak, after the peak happens on that kind of bar, the bar measurement in that map, the Tonle Sap begins to drain and drains into Vietnam's Mekong Delta, enabling conditions for extended agricultural outputs in Vietnam. It's an amazing process. It's one of the natural miracles of the Earth, and we're monitoring it in real time, watching it right now, actually. But there's been a lot of variability introduced to the Tonle Sap Lake's expansion and the Mekong flood pulse's expansion, and our work is providing insight into why that variability is occurring. So what you're seeing here is the peak expansion of each year over the last 6 years, and you're seeing how, with that blue line on each of those bars, there's a difference year to year. And also, if you note at the timing of each map, there's a movement of the peak to later in the year. So the timing of the peak is changing as well. And again, our work is beginning to help actors on the ground understand why that is happening. So we're able, through monitoring these 60 largest dams, provide insight on how those dam operations are changing the variability of the Tonle Sap Lake, really on a week-to-week basis. So the reason why I gave this example here with the peak of 2023 was that the peak expansion almost reached normal, and normal is hitting the top of that bar. But when you look at the graphs, the blue line represents what a normal flood pulse pattern looks like during a pre-dam era, before dams were impacting the region. And the distance between the bars and that normal line is what we think is driven by climate. The blue bars is observed flow to Stung Treng in Cambodia, a gauge far downstream and close to the Tonle Sap Lake. And that's what's observed. So what's observed versus the top line of that blue line is an example of how close things were to normal. But when you bring in the impacts of dams, how much dams restricted water, and by grouping different groupings of dams together, we can see which dams affected flow and brought down flow more so than others. And we came up with a conclusion that during the wet season 2023, dam restrictions, they kind of, if the dam restrictions weren't there, natural flow would have really helped the Tonle Sap Lake achieve that normal capacity. And that translates to better fish yields, better agricultural yields. One other example I want to point out here is 2021, when there was some extreme climate variability. But dam restrictions really brought down those flows. So in September 2021, you're seeing a 13% reduction of flow just by China's dams alone. Now, this could be seen as controversial information, but it's been out there for a while. We've been doing this work for 3 or 4 years now. And it's, again, been very much socialized in the region and leading to a constructive and productive conversation where downstream countries are taking this information to their negotiations with China and with each other about ways to better operate the river that can, say, optimize the expansion of the Tonle Sap Lake. So this is just one example of how Earth observation is increasing the negotiation power of downstream countries in a very complex situation and improving the understanding of natural hydrological features of the Mekong.
Thanks. I think that's a very interesting point, and that's actually a nice segue into the next question that I have for both Nina and Melissa. We have all these technologies and they're being developed, but what do you think would be required for them to actually also be able to inform policy? Nina, maybe we start with you.
I think one of the key things to consider to inform policy is what are the decisions that are on the table and what kind of information do we need to take such information and to also communicate that down to the scientists and the technical staff of whatever institution or body or academic institution is in charge of monitoring a river. I think what can help in the setting, in the context of transboundary rivers or water bodies, is that not only can we benefit from the cooperation in terms of the learning from each other's expertise, because capacity will be a limiting factor here. There's so much data out there in the open domain already, and high-resolution data in the private sector, but the capacity to interpret the data and derive knowledge from that will be a limiting factor. And I think that's why cooperation can lead to increased knowledge and better decision-making. Furthermore, I think we can also benefit from cooperation here if we consider shared satellite licenses. That's just a cost-saving example, but if we do so, then more access to the data and information that can inform policies will be available. And that doesn't only consider the transboundary, like, let's say, river management, but all other environmental questions related to a watershed that we need to take into consideration. I think Liz provided a great overview of the several variables we can observe, and I would not look at the transboundary river in isolation. I think, especially in the light of climate change and loss of biodiversity, rivers are very complex ecosystems, and I think there is so much knowledge that we can gain from sharing these data.
Thanks, Nina. Before I hand over to Melissa, just reminding everyone, if you have questions, have them ready. We'll get to your questions soon, but also, Zoe, if you can just wave at me if there's questions coming up online, that we take those as well. Melissa, how to inform policy with all that's out there?
It's been a great hearing from everyone's conversations. I'm going to approach this question from a slightly different angle. So I myself am a social science researcher, a geographer, and so I don't actually generally work with the data from a collection standpoint, but will often use that to inform the research that I do on transboundary cooperation and conflict. And so I think to answer this question, I'd like to just give two brief examples of how this is utilized and how it can be informed in a slightly different way than just looking at the physical data that we've been kind of more focusing on. So one of the data sets that we regularly use in my own work is the hydrosheds data set, where it's actually mapping the watershed boundaries of watersheds across the world, and then we've utilized that to create the transboundary watershed data set. This can really help to inform policies. Where you draw those borders will determine who might be involved and sit at that table to have a discussion, to be negotiated. Who are the actors that need to be included in that process? Something that we found in doing that work is that often some of the delta areas are actually excluded from that high resolution watershed boundaries, and so they need adjustment to ensure that we actually are including all of the agricultural areas and all of the actors that should be included in a discussion process. The other piece is thinking about conflict and cooperation, and we've heard a lot about how we can monitor for large infrastructure as well as the level of reservoirs, and so this can be really vital data for helping to monitor or potentially predict where conflict potential might arise, as there is a lot of research that backs that the construction or planned construction of large infrastructure in basins can be a potential risk for conflict in those basins. So being able to look at this data through more of a social science lens can also really help to inform policy.
Thanks. That's actually a key point that I think we want to move to now. One of the elephants in the room, I guess, and I'm turning that question to Bota. All these technologies are out there, they're all very promising. Your work, your PhD research focuses on trust between the countries, and we all know trust and data sharing are very linked. Trust shaping data sharing shaping trusts. So how do you think can these immense advances that we've seen over the last years, or how will they shape the relations between countries?
Yeah, thank you. And indeed, I'm looking on data sharing from trust perspective, and this is where also in doing my research, taking interviews, this open remote sensing data came quite a lot. And my, I think, answer would be that it is useful to make a distinction between, I think, transboundary basins where the issues with data are related to technological development, to funding or underfunding, versus those where issues are more political. And then in those where the issues are technical, then open source data, remote sensing data brings a lot of opportunities and actually becomes a relief. For example, we can look at the cases between Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan is upstream country and it is always requested data by downstream countries, but it is quite a poor country and it cannot afford, to have a lot of hydrological stations in the mountainous areas. And therefore, this actually being able to, by Kazakhstan, to be able to use remote sensing data was a relief for Kyrgyzstan, saying, oh, finally, they are not going to pressure us anymore. They can already see how much water we have. But when we look at the more politically complex settings, then we can look at the relationship between, for example, Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. This is where actually there are some minor nuances or threats to trust, because then when we look at data sharing, that's specifically this, and again, this linkage that you mentioned, that data sharing brings trust. But then what is important is this sharing component. This is where country willingly and intentionally shares data, and it allows it to demonstrate its goodwill, that it's willing to cooperate. This is kind of always considered as a first step. But then if this step is not happening, or, if downstream country, for example, already has access to data, then it kind of limits possibilities. But at the same time, looking at the case between Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, where Uzbekistan was a bit hesitant to share the data itself, and it was not that was quite sensitive issue that Kazakhstan can actually see where the reservoirs of water is in Uzbekistan are located and big channels. But then there was this big collapse of Sardoba Dam on the border between Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, the territory of Uzbekistan, and then the flooding went to Kazakhstan territory. And after that, actually, they were more open to use this open source data by Kazakhstan. And then after that, somehow it became more transparent. There was the invitation from Uzbekistan to Kazakhstan delegation to come and actually see all the reservoirs. So in that sense, I think availability of data, once it is normalized and then countries realize that other countries can see that, and then this, I think, power, data as power, I think this element somehow will fade away. And after that, I think with this normalization, this is where I think it can bring a lot of like transparency and trust as promised, even in politically difficult contexts.
Thanks. I think this is a very interesting example. I'm wondering if we look at the Nile, you also have your experience with data sharing as you presented, but also with trust, certainly. Any challenges you see in that regard?
Yeah, thank you, Suzanne. Obviously, in the Nile Basin, you have both types of challenges, the political ones, but also you have the ones related to technology and lack of access and capacity to use some of these tools. And there are definitely things that we deal with every day. Capacity building has to be a very major part of this process. Because it also removes some of the suspicions that people might have about these technologies. Over the years, what we found is that if you anchor your work in actual things that benefit the countries, where benefits can be seen very easily, projects, investments, or some other kind of early warning, or not data sharing just for the sake of sharing, but rather for the solution of a specific problem, then you start breaking down some of these barriers. Awareness about the availability of some of these options, I think, is still low in Africa generally, and there's a lot of work to be done to make sure that the people who are supposed to be using some of these technologies actually know that it exists, and maybe they also know where to go in order to get them, because everyone will always want to solve their problem, but they'll use the tools that they have readily available to them, and unless they are aware about the existence of these, then there can be a problem. Putting in place policy frameworks that recognize the role that Earth observation can play in terms of solving our problems becomes also very, very important, because then it can guide where there are lingering differences between countries. Then it can be the one that guides how the process should be handled. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. Before I open to the floor, I have one question that I'm very curious about, having worked in the Mekong, to you, Brian. The work that you've been doing has certainly shown some challenges or stirred some issues in the Mekong over the last years. So how do you reflect on this? How does the work that you, also coming from the outside, how has that affected relations between the countries there?
Well, the dam monitor now has use cases in all the governments of the Mekong, including the PRC, because the PRC has talked about it. And our work's been published in MRC publications too, so that's a kind of validation. It's definitely stirred a lot of informal discussion among key actors. And like I said, we know, because the Mekong River Commission tells us, that they're taking the data that they have on China's dams to their negotiations with China. But again, it hasn't come without, for the first year, there was a pretty intense state-led media disinformation campaign against us from the PRC. And there were tough times. We could, shoulder the blows, and we've made it through. And for the last 3 years, like I said, the data has been kind of normalized and socialized and seen as being something very constructive. So much so that in our weekly messaging, there are times like when we see the Tonle Sap expanding, and we see some big rain coming through to the upper basin, we think, oh, that's the time when the big dams could start to take the water. And we say in our messaging, this is the time not to do that. Maybe wait later in the wet season. And sometimes we think the message gets through. We don't know. We don't have validation on that. But in that particular instance, the Tonle Sap and the lower basin have a chance to kind of charge ecologically. Sometimes we say it and it doesn't happen. You know, as kind of being a third-party provider here, the work is definitely respected and had a lot of constructive use cases.
I want to open to the floor. I don't see you very well because of the light, but if you wave at me, we also have a microphone going around. So my suggestion would be we collect 3 questions, then give our speakers a chance to respond. You can also ask questions to to all of the lightning talk speakers. So Liz, Christina as well, and then I'm not sure if Genna is still online with us, but yes, great. So please go ahead. And maybe quickly also your name and your affiliation, and then a very short question.
A very good morning. My name is Sandy Limbata. I'm from South Africa. I work for national government that takes care of local municipalities. Quick questions. There's just to the whole panel really around the issue of data openness, availability, and accessibility, especially for people that need the data. So it's a question that I constantly ask myself of the so what. You do all you do, but does it really get to the local communities? And I think that for me is the most important thing, because these are the people that are in the catchment areas that have to deal with rivers every day. How does the work that you do translate to that kind of local action? Am I allowed to ask one quick last one?
Okay.
Oh, I'm being sneaky. I'm sorry for that. In terms of data sharing issues, have you guys asked yourself, why should countries? Do you give them a reason why they should share data? Because very often, this is part of my lessons, asking other government departments, when I ask them to share data, they always ask me, so why should we share data? Because we are overburdened with reporting. Do you guys constantly ask yourself that question? If you find answers, please share with me so I could. Thank you.
Thanks. We'll take another 2 questions. There's one over there, please.
Thank you. My name is Maha. I work for Nile Basin. My question is, we receive different information from various applications, especially on flood and drought. One application says that, one tool says that it is above average, other says average for rainfall, other says medium, intermediate. So there is disparity in the information that we receive. How can the information be aligned together so it will be beneficial to all users? This is number 1. Number 2, we had QGIS at the beginning of the year. Then again, after 6 months, we have a new update on QGIS. So before you catch up on learning how to use the tools, then you have a new one with new additions. So that doesn't leave room for mastering the tool. Thank you.
Thanks. I think that's, clearly having followed the first 2 presentations on what exists and what will potentially exist in the future. When Liz was speaking, I was like, oh my God, I must have been living under a rock for the last 10 years, but I think I haven't. So I share your concerns on that. I saw there was another question here.
Hi, my name is Abby. I'm from AquaWatch, a private company in New Zealand who is working on trying to build tools like this. So my question is not so much about how do we share data, although I am very aware that data without context is just a series of numbers, but from the other direction into the private industry, how can you share process, being able to take the flood monitoring, being able to take the Earth satellite data and provide that as an optional add-on to our clients, provides huge value and gets us closer to our goal of improving global water quality. But it's very difficult to engage between private and public sometimes.
Thanks. I think that's also an interesting question. Let's answer these questions first, while you might still gather additional ones. We'll do a second round. I'll maybe start with the one that is probably the most political, the most interesting. Why should countries share data? What's in it for them? I'm looking at Bota, I'm looking at Melissa. I don't know who of you wants to go first.
Oh, you start.
Yeah, fine. It is about data shared between countries. I think, well, at least in the literature that I read, it is pretty straightforward, and that as well it is confirmed by the practitioners when I was taking interviews that data is critical for, planning of water use and preparedness to disaster or extreme weather events. And but here we have a small caveat that very often data is more needed by downstream countries than upstream countries, and that in some cases or quite often puts upstream countries in a more powerful position towards downstream. So that's very short answer from me. Want to?
Melissa, you want to add?
Yeah, I'll add what I thought you were going to add, which was about the trust building piece. Oh, yeah. If you're interested more, you'll read her dissertation when it comes out on that, and a forthcoming paper with USIP, I believe, as well. But I think that there's a couple of reasons why I would argue that states would want to share data. First, I think it's an easy, I don't particularly like this terminology, but often a low-hanging fruit potentially in conflictive situations where there might be a low level of trust. So that might be an easy barrier where just sharing that data can help to start to construct a more substantive, trusting relationship in the long term. The second is I think it creates joint ownership, and that can keep political will involvement in the basin. And if there's a way, I heard you mention the overburdenness of reporting, and I think that's a huge challenge that all of us are facing. So how can we construct either joint platforms, or maybe I'm thinking of the SAVA Commission, where they have shared servers in each of the countries. So they all have ownership of the data, and they can all access and change the data. And so the reporting might not be as burdensome in some respects. So there's a lot of great examples, I think, where we can help to maybe address. So it's not just reporting and sharing data, but it's collaboration and cooperation in jointly creating and monitoring and harmonizing that data. And so it's shifting, I think, our framing a little bit.
Thanks. I think I would like to bundle the questions around differences in what certain applications, what certain tools tell you, with the question, how do you actually keep up with all these developments if there's something new all the time? And I'd like to have Tomasz and Genna think about it. Genna, additionally, also with the question of the private and public collaboration or not collaboration on that. Genna, do you want to start?
Yes, I'm happy to. Thanks, Susan. Yeah, I actually want to also bundle like two questions. Like, first question was about sharing. Why should we share? And there was a second question about like, how do I trust my forecast? One says it's high, one says it's low. And there is like cause and effect here connected that, like, yeah, if countries share data, organizations share data, that allows also researchers in first place to build better models. But the same is true like for private companies. So so I think there's some kind of the accuracy of the forecast or prediction. It really depends on how much data is available in a local context. So, and at the same time, that's like one of the challenges, how to make sure that this happens between private, public sector combined, and also research community. It's like, I don't have answer to this, but it's basically to stimulate this development of, I don't know, local companies, or making sure that this open challenges on its data sharing, it's like one of the challenges here, but more how to process all this data, how to bring to kind of common base level. That's, yeah, that's like some thoughts on this topic.
Thank you.
Not sure that's Susan, if you want what you want to answer. Yeah.
Thank you, Genna. Tomasz, do you want to add to any of those?
Probably I think that we all understand that sharing of the data is a problem, but not the major one. It's actually also data fusion, knowledge extraction, and knowledge sharing then later on. And I think it's not only transboundary between countries like Bota was telling, but I think Nina and Melissa were pointing out that there is more maybe boundaries also within a country, within societies. And I think the problem is sometimes, I respect very much what you do, but this is very much in the really global political context. But quite often the very local conflicts are also there between different sectors, and sometimes people are left behind. I must say that there is a good news. There's a lot of open data around, and there are people and researchers who can actually still master all the fusion of data and support even local unprivileged communities to fight for their rights to the ecosystem, because we don't want just like big powers to do that. And I think there is really a scope, and especially with new technologies for data fusion and also generation of more and more complex multi-physics and multi-scale models that take into account all interactions, we can actually improve the knowledge sharing and also make it accessible to those who are not unprivileged. I think this is good news.
Thanks, and also thanks for answering the question that I still had open on the list about the communities. I came from our colleague from South Africa. I think that gives us time for another round of questions, but I'm also checking Zoe online first. So if you could give the microphone to Zoe, who represents our large online crowd.
Thanks. There were two interesting questions, but I think one important piece that I don't think has really been covered is from Kassem Natouf. So it's known that field verification work must be carried out when using space methods. Is there any method or approach that has been followed in a region or at the global level to verify some of the satellite observed data?
Thanks. We'll give you time to think about this and capture more questions. There's two here, and then you'll be the last one.
Okay, thanks. My name is Saleh Hamid from the Nile Basin Initiative. Two quick points. We all know that the gap between in-situ data and Earth observed data is getting narrower. This is not known for the professionals, but not known to the decision makers. So we need to do some work, some effort to decision makers like parliamentarians, politicians, so that to encourage data sharing. That is one point. The other point, during negotiations, usually there is exchange of data. Depending on remotely sensed data, sometimes it's debatable. So what is the point here to make that is legal one? My question is, thank you.
Thanks. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. It was an excellent panel with a distribution of people with different positionalities around these technologies, which I think is very important. But the question I have is to the group, to do validation and to think about long-term sustainability and to get user needs right, to interact with people at multiple scales, government engagement is really critical. But right now we're talking about the rapid change in these technologies. Someone rightly mentioned a lack of capacity to interpret or reconcile between different sources, between different forecasts. What I see where we work in Nepal is a rush for a lot of entities to build tools and observations that come to the government and the government of Nepal saying, well, we're overwhelmed with interest in working with us. We can't partner with everyone. You're building stuff before talking to us meaningfully about what we actually need. So it's just a cautionary tale and a question to the group if how others, particularly maybe colleagues with the NBI, what kind of strategies are there for engaging early on and making sure that the tools that are coming in fit within a framework like what you have in NBI, which you said does accommodate new systems? Maybe there's a lessons to be learned about this problem, because with the proliferation of new technologies, more private sector actors, there's just going to be more and more coming. So it's going to be interesting.
Thanks. Good question.
Places like Nepal.
I think we still have time if you promise to both be fast and then your answers, also to take your question and then yours, and then because I overlooked you earlier, sorry. It's not easy with the light here. You're all just very blurry.
No, thank you. It's going to be very quick. I am Giitumeti Tsubane from Lesotho. So, of course, we are a small country of 2 million people or less, and a lot of proposals are coming about this observation, which is really nice. My question really, I think, is to Liz and other colleagues that have developed tools in terms of accuracy. For countries that really don't give you input data or ground data, how accurate can we utilize tools that are developed somewhere else? Can the Global South really get a similar benefit similar to the Global North? And I think you also touched the question of transboundary, because I think throughout the week so far, we've been talking transboundary as in countries, but we're not talking transboundary conflict, transboundary sharing in the country. I work at a catchment level, and in a catchment, there are communities and there are councils. So we have people that are governing councils. Now the question is, these tools, can we, of course, it's an issue of capacity also, how maybe would you advise that they be capacitated at that low level such that this whole sharing of data and analysis through the communities can be done properly? Because, I mean, we have different ranges, lowlands, highlands, and stuff like that.
Thanks.
So we cannot just have a uniform observation of these tools. Thanks.
Thanks. Could you pass the microphone just over here? Great.
Hi, everyone. My name's Alyssa Shoemaker. I work for USAID's Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance. And so my question was about kind of building on this like local watershed level discussion. We're dealing with ever increasing severity and frequency of drought. And so this is obviously affecting tons of people worldwide, especially in the humanitarian space. And that crisis is very slow moving, and that it's not something that you necessarily will see like a flood. Also, in terms of aquifer overuse, we have a lot of communities in need of groundwater, and the ability to see how recharge is working or not is also something that's not visible. So I'd love to hear more of a comment on any uses, applications that you all have seen in your work in these areas that are more slow moving or invisible visibly at the local community level. Thank you.
Great, thanks. As we're running out of time, I have a suggestion. I would suggest that you connect with Liz directly after the session. I'm sure you'll be able to have a chat for that question. I'd also love to have the question that was directed to Christina. If you could discuss that directly after the session and meet, which is also a nice invitation to continue the discussion over lunch. And then I would just go from left to right here. There were some questions targeted specifically, for example, at you, Michael, but if you could just very briefly in 3 sentences answer to any of the questions that you heard now that you think you would like to focus on, from field verification to how do we actually get it to the decision makers, but also how can we make sure we actually ask the countries or the basin organizations what they need in the first place, and then the accuracy question is maybe more for that end here. Bota, you want to start?
Yeah, and actually I really like that question regarding legitimization of data, and sorry that was addressed to Christina, but just quickly to touch upon that, because that came out a lot in the interviews that I was taking in transboundary basin. This aspect apparently is very important because it's not only stems from the formal documents, but also from other ethical more kind of aspects, but also something very informal, like just ask our permission to use that. So that aspect, I think it is quite important. Who decides if data is legitimate? Can it be used for joint planning, or can it be used only inside the country which has this data? So that's interesting question.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks.
Michael?
Yes, thank you very much. I'll give just a few comments. Number one is that I think data sharing, information exchange, and granting access to the public is a very good indicator of the status of cooperation among, especially in a transboundary context. So where you see a lot of suspicion and hiding data, then cooperation is always very slow. But also cooperation takes long. It's a slow process. That also means that the data sharing, you need to be patient. It's not going to happen overnight. Number two is that the stakeholders, the key stakeholders, have to be involved at all stages of the process, from the definition of your problem, developing strategies and everything. If you come at the end with very good charts and everything to show them and tell them to adopt, you're going to have a lot of problems, because they're the ones who should define the problem that you're dealing with, and then you work together to solve it. Number three is related to the issue of accuracy. I think we are all water resources. Okay, some of us are water resources professionals and hydrologists. We know that even the best modeling that we do, we are not going to get accurate. Yeah? It's not, the system that we deal with is so complex. But all the results that we can get can help us make informed decisions, the better decisions than if we were operating without this information. So it's better to look at what kind of dialogue and process can happen on the basis of this output that leads to better decision making, as opposed to how accurate the results are. Thank you.
Thanks. Nina, any concluding thoughts?
Thank you. Yeah, my thoughts relate to the decision making and the engagement of local communities, but also the decision makers at a higher level. If you think of briefing your director about a very important decision, you have very little time and you need to abstract the knowledge very much. And so there's not so much difference in terms of the simplicity that we want to enable so the decision maker can focus on what's at the table. And those can be very small decisions about do I irrigate my land now or not by a farmer, or it can be a decision that has a greater political context in a transboundary setting. As Michael has highlighted, engage with the stakeholders early to define the problem, and then maybe you can also benefit from this engagement later on. For instance, in the case of collecting in situ data, we have citizen scientists and platforms that allow like a more structured collection. There's gaps, but we can get to a point where we collect more data with the help of communities that are dedicated to that to learn more, and then models can be trained. So if a country shares more in situ data, the global models that are being developed based on Earth observation technology will also fit better to your local context, have a better accuracy. With that being said, there's always an error rate that is left. But you can benefit from sharing the data in this sense. Thank you.
Thanks. Try to be brief.
So I just want to echo what all of you have said about the inclusion of stakeholders in the process, particularly early on, and as it relates to your question about the engagement of private sector actors into these processes. As someone who often studies kind of power dynamics and access, I think that the challenges, particularly the increasing number of often private sector incorporated in global Earth observation data, it can have potential for power imbalances. Who has access to pay for that data? Who's directing and making those decisions to collect a particular type and sort of data set? And is that driven by profit-driven motives, or is that driven by the communities that actually need the particular data for a certain purpose? So that's why I fully support engaging early and often in ensuring that work is made accessible, it's public, it's open and transparent. And I think that's something that we might need to further address with respect to access and ownership of this data as we move forward, maybe from more of an international water law perspective.
2 sentences.
Quick wrap-up points. One is that when it's about keeping up with the new tools, when you're working in this space, sometimes people approach you and the providers approach you. So I gave a similar presentation at a conference a few years ago, and Umbra, which is a private commercial provider for synthetic aperture radar, approached us and said, hey, we can teach you how to task satellites for use in what you're doing. Fast forward 2 years, we're using a discount from that company to task into the storm and look at gloughs in Nepal as they're playing out. And we did that 10 days ago with the Tame Glough, which has been discussed here widely. The question is, how do you translate those discounts and access to governments and local stakeholders? And how do you have the conversation with the commercial providers to say, hey, here's a big market for you, but it's got to be provided at that discount or even lower rate. And one final comment is that always be communicating. Co-design, consult as much as you can. The Dam Monitor had co-design processes with the governments of Vietnam and governments of Thailand, with civil society groups throughout the entirety of the Mekong Basin. When we launch a new product, it goes through months of consultation with local people to get things right. When we launched, we didn't have that flood pulse monitoring product. And the first draft of it looked nothing like what we showed you. And again, it took a lot of iterative work to get it in a presentable way that can communicate to people in the region. So always be communicating and co-designing and co-owning when you can.
We're really running out of time, but I want to give you, Tomasz, and then Genna 1 sentence. But Tomasz first.
Yeah, I would just like to say that I mentioned that the tremendous floods that happened in Slovenia last year, our Prime Minister decided that they are going to use Earth observation and digital things for recovery, not only to repair, but to prepare better for future. This is good news, but the other thing is, gentleman there was talking about overwhelming offers to governments by different actors how to help, but there are also overwhelming requests. And it seems that with more and more frequent disasters, government on their own will not be able to cope with everything. And what we are doing in our stories now, we have pilot projects on every continent, how to articulate stories in a way that even private capital and so on would get involved into solving these environmental problems, because we know, like, a lot of industrial zones were flooded in Slovenia, tourism was affected and so on, so they are interested. And the question is now how to articulate this on societal level to do that. And everybody who has any ideas, help us.
Thanks. Genna, a last thought on that? One sentence.
Yeah, I think that just to keep it short is I think finding this balance between private, public sectors and academia, and as well as like data sharing, which data should be shared, and if it's private sector, it's you don't want to share, so you want to share, but you also want to profit from it. But finding the actual what data provides value, I think the finding this balance in this whole landscape, that's probably one of the challenges that we still have to solve. So
thank you. I do hear a phone, but that's not the closing sign, because I want to thank our speakers. Thanks. But I also want to give Claudette Spiteri from Jeff IW Learn the chance to just share her, as one of the co-conveners, her last reflections on the session. Claudette, if you come here, and you can also go this way. And then you can also let us go for lunch.
Yes, so I understood I have to be very quick. Well, thanks everybody for coming here. Thank you to the speakers and to, I agree, the very interesting and diverse panel, the techie ones and less techie ones. I think we saw a very small selection of what is available out there in terms of tools and data. Some are global, some are local, and with very specific examples from Mekong, Nile, and etc. And also, what does the future look like? What is feasible in the future? Higher resolution, real-time monitoring, AI, machine learning, and so on and so forth. I think we agree we are witnessing like a revolution in terms of data revolution with all these technologies and the, let's say, in terms of availability, the frequency and the quality of the data that we were seeing, and all the different applications. I think we've heard about water resource management, but also climate change adaptation, and also use in disaster risk management. Other points, definitely the implications, this cost reduction, and what that means in terms of opportunity for empowering states and empowering basin organizations to do water resource management more effectively. I listed down some implications like scientific base, improving the scientific base behind underpinning the transboundary agreements for informing policies, and there also the social science aspect came in, increasing negotiation power, implications for international water law, as well as things like stakeholder engagement, the importance of that in early stages, transparency and trust. All good. A number of challenges, definitely. The ones that I put forward here, I think what we saw is that despite all these opportunities, Earth observation data will not replace in situ data. It's only complementing. I think it's good to highlight that. The need for technical capacities to use the data, to interpret the data, to extract knowledge, so going beyond just data. Challenges of data sharing, I think national security was also brought up, and the importance to build the data exchange obligations into treaties, and sustainability of all these tools, like going beyond pilots and using them on a regular basis. So with so much out there, I think we've heard that, and so much in the pipeline being developed, I think what we need, the bottom line, is partnerships and also trusted relationships to take this forward. Well, I thank everybody, speakers, panelists, Susan, Christina, for putting this very interesting session together, and thank you for being here.
Recording stopped.